Well everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the iPhone 13 mini and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now one thing I will definitely tell you about this specific phone is that I still think it's a very solid device and you can't really go wrong with it. Like, it is still one of the best phones you can buy, especially in that smaller form factor. And luckily for us, Apple is still selling it brand new and it's still available on Amazon as well. So I will leave some links in the description. If you want to go and buy them from there, you can help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of this specific phone, we actually do have, in my opinion, a pretty decent display. So this definitely isn't like the best display of all time, but as I mentioned before, I think Apple did a pretty good job with this display back then, and I still think it holds up decently well in this day and age. So on the front, 5.4-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display, and again, it's a decent display. It's definitely not the best thing ever made, but it could definitely have been worse, and I definitely do think in this day and age, definitely not a bad display at all. You have a little bit of a notch up top, a little tiny bit of bezel, like there's barely even any bezel, I don't even know why I mentioned that, and overall the phone still looks pretty good. Now, I think most of you know this by now, but this phone was competing for like the smaller form factor type of device, and I think I like that a lot. I think that was great, but I do think since then it's been a little bit of a different type of situation, since a lot of phones pretty much have been getting bigger and bigger, and since Apple has now kind of moved towards more of those those plus size phones, and they removed the mini lineup, this very well may in fact be one of the shortest lifespans of any phone Apple's ever made. It's up there with the iPhone 5C, but the 5C kind of reincarnated into like the iPhone SE lineup. This phone with the mini is like, it might just be this one, to be honest. On the bottom, we had the lightning port, on the sides, the power button and whatnot. And on the back, we had our standard glass back, which I think still looks pretty good. I don't think there's too much to complain about it in that standpoint. We have that dual camera setup on the top left as well. And overall, the phone still feels very good. And it's funny because when you actually compare this phone and how it feels against some other, smaller phones, even like the Pixel 6a and 4a are kind of considered small. The S10e was considered, like Galaxy S10e was considered a kind of a small phone too. This one is the smallest out of all of them. So it is very interesting how, Apple at that time was able to make this small of a phone, mostly the 12 mini, but this phone was so small that, people ended up buying it and loving it. And I think this iteration, the, difference from a 12 mini and 13 mini, it's actually a pretty big difference. And I kind of do wish that Apple just made this one as the original one. Like, I just wish they just made this as the iPhone 13 mini instead of going around and like doing these other things like with the iPhone 12 mini. I wish it was just the 13 mini when it first came out, because this phone was very good. So in terms of that, I would definitely say this phone on the outside, thumbs up for me for sure. Now in the camera department, as I mentioned, this phone had that dual camera setup on the back. It had a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor. Now, I definitely do think that this phone overall was pretty decent. It was a pretty good, performing phone in that camera standpoint. You had 4K at 60 on the front and the back, which was awesome. And like I mentioned, when you have a phone like the iPhone 13 mini, this phone is going to be lasting for a long period of time in that camera department. The only thing that it's even kind of missing is like a telephoto lens. Like, that would have been kind of nice, and maybe like a little bit of a wider, front-facing camera. But I think other than that, you can't really go wrong with this type of phone camera. I think it takes very decent photos. You still have cinematic mode, portrait mode, a lot of other modes inside of the camera. And if you needed a device to just quickly take photos here and there, this is a pretty good camera. It's funny because this phone is so small that you would get the impression that it's like not that good of a camera, but it definitely is. I mean, it's the same thing as the iPhone 13 camera, and that was honestly a pretty good, camera as well. Now on top of that, applications like TikTok and Snapchat and those type of apps are going to be perfectly fine. You're going to be getting a pretty solid experience from those types of applications as well. So I definitely would tell you, in my opinion, the camera quality of the iPhone 13 mini is pretty good. There's not really too much to complain about, and I would say it still gets a thumbs up for me for sure. Now, moving on to the software and the longevity of this portion, this is another one of those things where you kind of have to keep in mind. This phone, in my opinion, first of all, it's a pretty good, performing phone, but because of that, it's also going to be a good supported phone, probably for a long period of time as well. Apple keeps their devices, for the most part, supported for a long period of time. So you shouldn't really be worried about when this phone is going to be discontinued or if it's going to be discontinued tomorrow. That's not really going to be the case. These phones will last for a very long period of time. So even in that standpoint, I probably wouldn't freak out about it too much. But I will say on top of that, this phone, if you're planning on getting this phone or any phones like this, you do have to keep in mind that there are other devices, that Apple sells too, like the iPhone 14s. Like if you have all the money, go for those. But even with the iPhone 14, Apple still has that Apple A15 chip inside of that device, which is the same chipset inside of this device. So you could very well make the argument that Apple may actually end up supporting this phone for even basically as long as the next gen of phones, which are the iPhone 14s. So it's a very interesting thing. Again, I don't know 100% what's going to be the answer here, but that at the end of the day is a very interesting thing that I think a lot of people actually end up forgetting about. So from that perspective, I would say the software and the longevity portion definitely gets a thumbs up for me for sure. Now, another thing I want to go ahead and throw in here as well is the performance of this phone. This device has that Apple A15 Bionic chip inside of it. It also has 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, the RAM situation, I can hear a lot of people kind of stating that phones nowadays do have way more RAM inside of them, and that is completely true. But I do think you kind of have to remember that with an iPhone like any iPhone for the most part, these iPhones last so long, and the software is so optimized for their devices that it doesn't really make too much sense as to why Apple would go and put like 30 gigabytes of RAM on the side of an iPhone, because these things, even on 4 gigs, still perform very, very well. So I would argue that in that standpoint, even 4 is perfectly fine, but the performance of this phone, in my opinion, is very, very good. It is a very smooth performing phone, and again, there's just not that much to complain about there. A few things you kind of have to keep in mind though is that, for one, with this type of device, you are getting, a very good performing phone, not much to complain about there, but also the chipset inside is still very powerful. If you're playing standard games, like smaller types of games and applications, you're going to be perfectly fine there. There is pretty much not that much to complain about at all. But even on those heavier intensive games that I've played so many times, because this thing, same chipset as the iPhone 15, even the 14 kind of, it's a very good performing phone. I've had way more phones that have performed way worse than this thing. So I think that is kind of a big thing to keep in mind. I think if you wanted to use a phone that's going to last you for many years, this is clearly still going to be one of them. It wouldn't be the one I would recommend buying like first. I would think the iPhone 13 might be the better one here just because of the bigger battery. But I do think the 13 mini is a very solid phone, and the performance is definitely one of the better things about this phone for sure. Now, ending it off with the battery life, it does have a 2,438 mAh battery. Now, I think that's a pretty good size battery to have inside of a phone like this. I think the 12 mini's battery size was too small. I think this one is pretty good. I think Apple optimized that A15 chip as well, making it a little bit more optimized. But I will say that, again, the better battery life devices are for sure the iPhone 13s and iPhone 13 Pros, I would argue. But this phone is a very good battery life for that size. And I definitely do think that, if you're getting a phone of this size, you would probably expect the battery life to be worse. But this battery life is better than you would expect. So from that perspective, thumbs up for me as well. And to kind of sum up this video, what I'll definitely tell you is, I think the iPhone 13 mini is still completely worth it. I think it's still one of the best phones you can buy. It's a very solid phone, has tons of capability. And if you're not really complaining too much about the capability behind maybe the lack of 120 Hz display or the lack of telephoto lens or a small size phone, you're going to have a wonderful experience of this device for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.